Welcome back to Parallax Views. Mickey Huff of Project Censored, one of my favorite resources. How are you doing, Mickey?
I'm doing all right, man. Thanks for having me back on the show. I follow what you do online, and you've been interviewing a whole host of pretty amazing people. So it's an honor to be invited back. Thank you.
Well, you guys at Project Censored have been doing a lot lately. So you're going to have to fill me in. There's the new Project Censored movie, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, narrated and edited by Abby Martin. And also, there's a new Project Censored book, right?
Well, the new book Andy Lee Roth and I are finishing literally right now this month, but we did put together last month, we edited a censored news policing in prisons reader. That's a 52-page reader based on a lot of the work and the stories that we've done on police brutality and school to prison pipeline and prison reform, prison abolition. So we've done a lot of those stories over the years. So Andy and I, Andy whipped together a list. We were talking to our publisher at 7 Stories, Dan Simon, and they were putting out a prison reader, and we said, well, we could put out one on our own. We have that much material. And so we whipped that up together and wrote a foreword for it. So that's free, by the way. So if your viewers / listeners, people that follow your program, if they're interested, go to projectcensored.org. That's as in censorship, right? Project Censored. And on the front page, you can download the e-reader for free. If you're on the website and you go to other projects, you can click on the new Project Censored movie. We teamed up again with Doug Hecker and Chris Oscar, Janet and Richard Oscar, greatly offered us some support to put together yet another film following up on our 2013 Project Censored the movie, Ending the Reign of Junk Food News. And that's the United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion film. We actually finished that earlier this year, and we're in the Sonoma International Film Festival, and we were getting ready to go on the road with it, and COVID hit. So we just decided to put the film up online for free. So it's up online at YouTube. Abby Martin of the Empire Files, Media Roots, did the editing, the narrating. Nolan Higdon and I, with Andy Lee Roth, put together a lot of sort of, how we wanted things maybe to end up. And we interviewed, Nolan's students, actually. The film was shot by students. It's filmed by students. And Abby put it together. And so this is yet another way that we do critical media literacy education, is we get hands-on. Like, students help us put together the Project Censored book. They work with us on the radio. They work with this, they work with us on the prison reader. Amber Yang, former student of ours at SF State, San Francisco State, had a great piece on
alternative. She was just on the show.
Yeah, and actually, I was just going to say, she was just on your show. Thanks so much for having her on. What a great piece she did, and she's amazing. She's a wonderful person who does some really fantastic work for restorative justice and youth education. And we also work with people K-12 education. So, yeah, it wasn't well, you weren't wrong when you said that we're up to an awful lot these days. So I would certainly ask people, if they wish, go to projectcensored.org. And there's a lot of free stuff there. And we are pre-selling Nolan Higdon's new book, The Anatomy of Fake News, Critical News Literacy Education. And that's on UC Press, University of California Press. That's going to come out later this summer. We're offering a special deal on it with signed copies shipped later in the month. So anybody that's interested, check that out. And I'm pretty sure you're going to have Nolan on the show here pretty soon, if not even later on this one.
So, we hear the term fake news law. Of course, Project Censored has been around for, over 40 years now, right?
It's 1976. That's right.
Wow.
We were founded at Sonoma State University, Carl Jensen. In fact, the late Hugh Downs, who just passed away at 99 last week, he actually kind of broke ranks with corporate media types and supported Carl's project. He wrote the first introduction to the first project book. Carl did a monthly newsletter since 1976. The first book, 1993. And then Hugh Downs later went on to do a foreword for Carl's last book on a history of muckraking in the United States. So yeah, you're right. We've been around a while. Peter Phillips, the sociologist, took over in 1997. And then I worked with Peter and became director in 2010. And Andy Lee Roth was in and out and has been our associate director. I think this is my 9th book with Andy on 7 Stories Press that I'm finishing right now. So yeah, we've had a long legacy of media studies, media criticism. We're an anti-censorship, pro-First Amendment organization. We're part of the National Coalition Against Censorship. We're part of Banned Books Week. So we've really grown a lot over the years, and we've moved into our radio show on Pacifica Radio on 50 stations is 10 years now. So we've really grown the project from where Carl started and where Peter took off. And we're also on about 15 to 20 campuses with our critical media literacy education and our global critical media literacy project at gcml.org.
And in regards to fake news, fighting the fake news invasion. Now I can just hear people groaning saying, oh, is this like going to be one of those like pro-Trump things? Oh, fake news. That's what Trump says. You guys are not talking in the Trump lingo.
No, not at all. And in fact, as Nolan Higdon points out in his new book, The Anatomy of Fake News, is kind of a rip on a lot of the things that he and I pointed out in our co-authored book From City Lights, which came out a year ago, United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. We very specifically were not writing a Trump book, not a Trumpian fake news book, not a Trump-centric book. But of course, Trump is the one that really helped that term get off leash. 10, 15 years ago in communication studies, fake news as a term referred to satire. It referred to the late night TV shows on Comedy Central at the time with Stephen Colbert and the Colbert Report and the Daily Show. What's later morphed into some more commentary and things with, I guess, like John Oliver and, kind of blurring the line, investigative comedy is a term that comes to mind, kind of riffing from George Carlin all the way up through Lee Camp, right? But fake news is really just disinformation and propaganda. And, we go over that in the film, the documentary film. We've talked about it in the last several censored books, and we specifically talk about it in the weird postmodern abyss of post-truth. Right? We allegedly live in this post-truth world, and Oxford Dictionary actually claimed that post-truth was the hyphenated word of the year in 2016, kind of accompanying the 2016 election, where Democrats and those started using the term fake news to decry Trump's false statements, and to begin to claim that the Russians were interfering and spreading fake news all over the internet. By the way, in our last book, we have a whole chapter by Emil Marmol and Lee Major that's online for free on how the corporate media and establishment media are using the fight against fake news as a Trojan horse to censor and deplatform non-corporate sources online. And the amount of money and time and effort spent by Russia on the election was absolutely an abysmal pittance and drop in the bucket compared to the $6 billion that was being spent by campaigns and free coverage that the corporate media was giving the major candidates at the time. So when we talk about fake news, we have to go back to the root of how the term is sort of metamorphosized and then been weaponized, right? And Trump, being a show person and a con man in many ways, really in the infotainment universe of pseudo-reality television, Trump very quickly picks up on these things, and he used that term against the corporate media themselves, whom as an institution had already had such decayed trust from the public that he was able to turn it around and weaponize it against them, specifically because major outlets from the New York Times to the Washington Post, they peddle fake news and propaganda with some regularity. That's not to say they never report anything worthwhile or that they're all fake news. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am suggesting is when the Washington Post, after the election, reports about Russia allegedly hacking a power grid in Vermont with no evidence, they're called out by Forbes magazine, then they have to embarrassingly retract the story days later as having no merit whatsoever. They're handing on a platter ammunition to the Trump administration, where he then started to call the press the enemy of the people, attack James Acosta of CNN, and then we were off to the races, right? And so fake news then is actually this contested area of propaganda. And specifically, I would suggest disinformation. Misinformation, well, we all make mistakes. If something is intentionally put out where outlets, reporters, or other information disseminators are aware that it is inaccurate, then that is where we start to get into disinformation, right? And then the different kinds of propaganda, from white to gray to black, etc. But as we say in the documentary as well, we're tired of the term fake news. Just as Margaret Sullivan, the media critic over at the Washington Post at the time, Margaret Sullivan wrote after the 2016 election, while the Washington Post was peddling bogus stories, while later on the New York Times peddles bogus stories about Venezuela and Guaido, they just peddled a fake story about Russia putting bounties on the U.S. troops in Afghanistan that's seemingly evaporated just in the last couple of days.
Yeah, that was a quick one.
I'm sorry?
I said that was a quick one. That was
a quick one. It only lasted like a week. But back to Margaret Sullivan, they keep trying. But back to Margaret Sullivan. Margaret Sullivan said that, we need to retire the term fake news. And I couldn't agree more. But my point to her more specifically was, why don't we just retire the practice? Instead of worrying about people weaponizing the term, why don't we just have a more credible fourth estate that doesn't get caught up in the machinations of deep state propaganda, corporate ownership, advertisers? Now, obviously, we're riffing on Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's great book on manufacturing consent from 1988 that we've updated for the 21st century with Rob Williams on the Project Censored website, an update on the on the propaganda model for the 21st century in a digital media landscape. So, here we still are in the midst of a pandemic, the 2020 election, and, fake news, propaganda, disinformation. I mean, it flies from all directions. And so we just mentioned how, we saw sort of in an historical vacuum, the New York Times crowing about how Russia, right in the midst while we're looking at withdrawal of troops, right in the midst when we're talking with Germany about what are we going to do, we need to get out. We shouldn't be in Afghanistan anyway, but the New York Times pretends that that's not even an option. And they conveniently throw down the memory hole, the history from 40 years ago when the CIA was training a guy named Osama bin Laden to attack Russians in Afghanistan there after our colossal imperial failures in Vietnam. So, there's plenty of finger pointing and blame to go around, and that includes, JG, with us as news consumers. And Mark Crispin Miller at NYU in our film talks about the problem with the way we talk about news consumption, because it's as if we're sort of just eating so much junk food news. We just turn it on and suck it in, and we don't think critically about it at all. Well, that's part of the problem, is that not only do we see news outlets getting sloppy, having cut budgets, conglomerated ownership, also kowtowing to advertiser owner interests and state interests of various types, we now have fewer reporters reporting about more and more complex things. Right. And so when we talk about how we consume news as a product, we're talking about, as Peter Phillips says in his book Giants on the Global Power Elite, and says also in our film United States of Distraction, about 80% of much of the headline news that we see around the world is prepackaged and processed in part by a handful of major public relations firms that work with everybody from intelligence agencies to toothpaste companies. So we really live in a sort of a mirage, right? A pseudo reality where post-truth becomes whatever our own confirmation biases says that it is. And we don't believe that at Project Censored. We believe that there is empirical fact-based evidence. We believe there is an important way to report ethically information based on the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics that we highlight again in our forthcoming book, Project Censored State of the Free Press 2021. That'll be out December 1, 7 Stories Press. But again, we're still ever tilting against the monikers and practices of fake news, disinformation, and propaganda.
Now, what I really liked about the documentary at the beginning of it was you start with a quote. Today's fake news is yesterday's fake history by Ralph McGehee. Maybe you could tell my listeners who he was, because he's a very interesting former CIA figure.
Recently deceased, McGehee served in the CIA from the 50s through the early 50s to the late 70s. So, what historians would call the height of the Cold War. as a result of the Church Committee in the mid-1970s after the calamities of Watergate and collapse of Vietnam and so forth. There was a brief window where Frank Church began investigating, a senator from Kansas began investigating a lot of the wrongdoings of U.S. agencies, many of the lies that were exposed when Dan Ellsberg from the Rand Corporation exposed them with the Pentagon Papers, right? McGahee kind of fits through all of that in his memoirs, and he wrote a lot about a lot about the stories that were just shoved down the memory hole, the untold histories of U.S. involvement in Indonesia and Kissinger and so forth. And, McGahee's point was saying that, in paraphrase of that too, Peter Kuznick and Oliver Stone riff on in Untold History is today's fake news is tomorrow's fake history. Meaning you could riff, whatever way you put it, whether you want to put it the way McGahee put it or put it in another way, journalism, as you go back and look at Phil Graham at the Washington Post, and he said this in several speeches in the 1950s, 1960s, also the height of the Cold War. Graham also claimed that journalism is the first rough draft of history. So journalists have a huge responsibility to get it right. But what we also found out in the Church Committee hearings is something called the Mighty Wurlitzer program, Frank Wisner, the connections of the CIA's Operation Mockingbird with the Washington Post, with major news outlets. Later, Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post Watergate fame with Bob Woodward wrote a 1977 op-ed for the Rolling Stone, the magazine.
Operation Mockingbird, right?
Where he outed claimed he had 400 plus journalists that were part of this operation. And the Wurlitzer program was actually much broader and international. That was written about by Brian Covert, no pun intended. Covert wrote that for us in Project Censored a number of years ago. And you can actually see that for free online, a history of CIA media manipulation called the Mighty Wurlitzer. By Brian Covert, who's a journalist and professor in Japan that we've long worked with. So back to McGahee, this is all stuff that was coming out in the 1970s. And of course, by 1981, we hear William Casey at the head of the CIA. One of the first quotes he says coming out of a meeting with the Reagan administration, caught by Barbara Honegger and published in the Philadelphia Inquirer at the time, was, "We'll know our disinformation campaign is complete when everything the American public believes is false." So the CIA and other deep state agencies around the world have long been engaged in information war. There's nothing new about any of that. But the technology in the digital era has made it an incredible challenge for us, this information war, that we've been warned about by people who are frontline practitioners in it. Like a New Knowledge, right? A company that's since changed their mind. That was one of three of the main agencies, main private agencies that was contracting with the Senate Intelligence Committee of the United States government in the last few years, where they were feeding the agency information about how Russia was trying to hack elections and do all these things. Well, the curious thing about New Knowledge is the whole mission of New Knowledge as a corporation was to investigate Russian interference in U.S. politics. So if you're a hammer, every problem you see looks like a nail. If you're an organization that's looking for Russian interference, you're going to find it and then blow it up to raise more money. That's not to say that Russia wasn't interfering. It's to say that it was exaggerated the impact that it actually had versus about 100 other reasons that the Democrats won but yet still lost in the Electoral College, the 2016 election. So we are in an information war. It has a long history, and we have an obligation to be more critically media literate citizens, which is why at Project Censored, we believe that the antidote to this fake news pandemic itself is critical media literacy education, teaching people how not to be fooled, how to check their own confirmation biases, how to become aware of their own invisible implicit biases. And, Nolan Higdon and I are actually writing another book for Rutledge right now on critical thinking. It's a critical thinking textbook with a background in critical media literacy that really looks at how we need to learn once again how to have civil conversation with each other about contentious issues and learn how to agree to disagree long enough to learn about each other and to move our conversations and dialogues forward in the public sphere, not just keep lobbing gotcha missiles at each other from behind our keyboards on social media.
Not just throwing memes and hashtags at each other.
Come on, man. We have just sunk into such a depraved sort of superficial society. It's worse than what Neil Postman even imagined in amusing ourselves to death. We're literally verging on Mike Judge here with Idiocracy. And they're doing a reboot of Beavis and Butthead because Judge said it seemed like the time was right to get stupid again. Well, as we wrote about in as we quoted Lao Tzu in United States of Distraction, if you're not careful, you'll likely end up where you're heading. Are we there yet? Are we in a morass of total confirmation bias propaganda and mudslinging? The founders of this country were no strangers to using the press to attack each other over sordid affairs and tabloidized like issues. Many cases, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and that would be, in this case, the cherry tree that George Washington never cut down because he could tell a lie, because early American historians like Parson Weems advocated for early American chroniclers and historians to lie about our history, to puff up our presence, not only among ourselves, but around the world. And that was 200 and some years ago. And here we are, still doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just talking to a history writer, popular history, William Hoagland, and we were talking about how there was this period in the 20th century where Charles Baird was a huge name within history. And I mean, people can say that he got things wrong and whatnot, but he asked an interesting question. He's like, well, is there an economic way to look at the United States Constitution? And now you can't even ask that anymore.
It's pretty riveting. He wrote that over, he and his wife, that was over 100 years ago. In the progressive era, which, relatively speaking, certainly had a bit to be desired. However, it was a departure away from 19th century sort of laissez-faire corporate capitalism, unbridled corporate capitalism in a gilded era. And so the progressive era offered some reforms, and of course we all know what that means. That means the overall structure of the system will likely go unscathed. But we'll throw some treats to the disgruntled masses, so to speak, right? And it was a step forward for many workers and many women and many children, and that is actually true. It did very little for people of color or specific immigrant groups, the progressive era, and of course Wilson was a consummate racist and an imperialist. But during that period, so was Roosevelt. During that period, Teddy, Beard really kind of rose up out of that kind of brief period of a heyday of muckraking before yellow journalism, ruined it, with Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, The Shame of the Cities. There was a lot of stellar investigative reporting going on at that time, and I think Beard's research kind of comes out of a lot of that and says, hey, why are we not asking some of the most basic and fundamental questions about how the country was formed, who did it, and why? And as an historian myself, going back to that period, you take a look at it, and it's mostly the merchants as the rabble-rousers against the crown, against the East India Tea Company, et cetera, et cetera. And they needed to have a way to sort of separate their economy from Britain in a way that they could benefit but also piggyback, which is, of course, the central theme of Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, not the propaganda of Broadway I don't need to get into right now. There's plenty of it there. But if you go back, all Beard was doing was saying, who are these people? Where did they get their wealth? What were their stories? I mean, even people like Hamilton, who decried slavery publicly, profited from it and worked for a company that peddled in it. So, I mean, it tainted everything. And so when Beard went back and said, who are these people and how did they coerce almost a third of the population, something as mad as rail against King George? Well, it was through the propaganda of the Declaration of Independence that cherry-picked the ideas of people like David Hume or John Locke, etc., from 100 years earlier or more, and say, hey, you should be free. You can't put up with tyranny. Well, then what happened is of course, these people eventually turn right back around and try to oppress the very people that were fighting for the independence versus revolution with their whiskey taxes and everything else, which led to the decay of the Articles of Confederation and the propping up of the new U.S. Constitution in 1787 that lacked the Bill of Rights until 1791. Why am I bringing that up? Beard went back and looked to see, how did that happen? Why did that happen? Why was there a whiskey rebellion? What was that about? who was Daniel Shays, and what did these people stand for, and how much of the revolutionary ethos was buried in Philadelphia, in New York and Philadelphia in many cases. But Beard had the temerity to say, these people used Enlightenment principles as a cover to shield the brazen early pre-corporate capitalist sensibilities of the time. We went through a huge economic growth period in the early 6 presidencies up through the period of Jackson, with massive westward expansion from Jefferson to Jackson based on racism, genocide of indigenous peoples. And once again, Beard went back and said, what are you trying to pretend like this is all about freedom? It's about freedom to steal resources, including labor, as a major.
But that's the crazy thing. He's been sort of and I mean, this is something Project Censored gets at. He's one of those figures that has been memory hold.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in the historical canon, if you go through graduate school and don't talk about Beard, somebody's not doing their job. But I have to say, when I went through graduate school in the 90s, and I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, right? So not too far outside of Pittsburgh. And I went to Youngstown State University, big time working class, kind of college. My grandpa worked at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. My dad worked at a power plant, later got asbestos cancer, and died from this. I grew up in a working class community. So I was one of the early people that got a chance to go to college. And even though I was a musician and into art and philosophy, history seemed to me as a really great foundation to do almost anything. So when I started to go through, and I had access to a lot of wonderful minds and, PhDs from all over the place that were working there. That's back when you had 15, 16 full-time faculty at a history department.
Right.
Now I'm chairing one that has 5 with 20 adjuncts. So you see how that's flipped, right? But even among these people, there were only 1 or 2 of them when I got to graduate school that really talked about Beard, and that ever even mentioned people like Howard Zinn, for example. And Zinn wrote The People's History of the United States in 1980. I mean, I didn't go to college until 89. I was in grad school through 95, late 90s. It was, that stuff was like getting memory hold then. So when I really started to teach college history, when I moved to California in 2000, that's where I went back and just uncovered all this stuff. I went back and looked at all these books and all this knowledge and all these journals and all this stuff from the American Historical Association and all these things, Eric Foner, great historian. And I just started looking at it like, what is missing here? And of course, I was already a fan of Project Censored by the early 90s because I had gotten Carl Jensen's book. I found it on the shelf of a Barnes and Noble, just censored, and I was big into the arts. I was big into metal and punk and Jello Biafra. Interesting story, Jello Biafra in San Francisco, and Bruce Brugman, who founded one of the oldest weekly, The Guardian, not in London, but The Guardian, SF Bay Guardian, SF Bay Guardian. He would run the top 10 censored stories every year, and that's where Biafra would get some ideas for Dead Kennedy's lyric songs and spoken word stuff. And I subsequently got to meet Jello and so on. Interesting fellow. But nevertheless, back to this story, I basically had to go back and sort of recreate pedagogy and curriculum because I said, I don't want to just repeat and regurgitate things to my students in classes. And this was also at a time, 1995-ish, was right when the political sociologist James Lowen came out with Lies My Teacher Told Me, which the central thesis of that, Lowen has a new book on PM Press, by the way, looking at some of the issues with monuments. And he wrote another book called Lies Across America about the lies of monuments and state parks. Very timely now, even though he wrote that book nearly, like 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. Anyway, Lowen, he said, look, there's a reason that students don't like history. There's a reason the history profession is seen as dull and boring. It's the same reason that civics died in high school. It's because people won't address the real matters, the controversies, and the cover-ups, right? And so the segue for me, back to McGahey, today's fake history is, today's fake news is tomorrow's fake history, or the iteration in which he put it. To me, I felt I had an obligation to do that both as a journalist and an historian. If we don't get the stories right the first time, they get harder and harder to correct as time goes by, as Charles Beard would remind us, right? Is that here he laid it out for us, And look, if you follow like C. Wright Mills, the power elites of 1956, G. William Domhoff, Who Rules America, Peter Phillips, Giants, the global power elites, William Robinson. These are all people in this tradition that are saying, look who owns the world. You know, this is not about the Illuminati. This is not about some idiotic xenophobic conspiracies of the protocols of the elders of Zion.
It's the
history of capitalism.
It's the line that Utah Phillips had. He said, you know, the planet is not being or the planet is not dying, it is being killed.
And the people committing its murder have names and addresses. I have that quote on my office wall with a picture of me and Utah Phillips. I have on my F. Bush shirt, flag shirt, and we're at the anti-war protest in San Francisco on the eve of the second Iraq invasion. And I've got a picture of he and I in my office with that quote blazoned right on it. And Peter Phillips, in his book, The Global Power Elite, names the names of the 399 people. He names the brokerage firms. He names the investment companies. He names their cross boards of directorates. He lays it out. You know, and Abby Martin at the Empire Files did an amazing interview with him. We've done numerous shows with Peter Phillips. But I think one of the next documentary film projects we may embark upon is that one that kind of takes a look from Beard to C. Wright Mills, Domhoff, Robinson, Phillips, that kind of thread, you know, and really kind of make it palatable for what's going on right now, because what's going on right now with the Jeff Bezos and the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, all these kind of things, BlackRock, these are the people that are pulling the strings of global capital, and they control everything from the markets to trade. They basically have a lock on most of the nonprofits that gobble up 90% of the funding, and they ultimately end up controlling our narratives and controlling the media, as well as elected representatives, Ariel quotes. So we really need to go back to historians like Beard and pull back the curtain. And look, if you don't take Beard's word for it, take the nephew of Sigmund Freud's word, Eddie Bernays, who wrote in Propaganda in 1928 that there is a secret group of people that control public narratives in politics, and that is the way of modern democratic states. He admitted this is how you control narratives. He was proud of doing it. He died after he was 100 years old. He controlled everything from the narratives of World War I to Guatemala to things going on into the 1990s.
Public relations.
Bernays set the Eddie Bernays Manufacturing Consent Engineering Opinion that later became the basis for Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent book from 1988, based on a lot of the work from social psychologist Alex Carey that talked a lot about social psychology and manipulation of the masses going back to Freud.
Now, I know we're running short on time. I just have one more question for you, if I could. I know you have the book out on, censored news stories related to policing, but I want to talk about how this is not a new phenomena, and there's a memory hold incident that you have a project about right now, Kent State. You've been doing a project related to Kent State. Let's cover that real quick.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I actually, having grown up not terribly far from Kent State, where the May 4th, 1970 massacre took place, when Governor Rhodes, Republican ally of Richard Nixon, and his law and order campaign against bums and thugs on campus, as Nixon would put it, riffing too on Reagan, who was governor of California prior to that. There was this effort to really clamp down on anti-war protests on campus. And I actually did my graduate thesis on the Kent State shootings, not on the specific shootings themselves, going back to the early I.F. Stone and Murder at Kent State. Was fantastic. One of the best books on that to date, in my view, still. The great muckraker I.F. Stone, Izzy Stone. But what I was looking at was I was trying to figure out who was controlling the narrative around who got shot, who did the shootings, was there an order? And that whole situation, as you put it, was memory hold. Not only did the Kent State administration want to try to cover up the shootings and blame the protesters and arrest the Kent State 25, cover up the possibility that the ROTC building was actually lit on fire by people there on purpose, not the protesters, as sociologist Elaine Wellen later alleged, who was later married to Tom Loff, who was one of the Kent State 25. They were there. Elaine Wellen was at the ROTC building before it burned. We covered that in a Project Censored chapter in 2013 in Dispatches from the Media Revolution. I later, through a friend of mine, Dirk Hermance, who I knew in grad school, and I met people through him and others, Jim Algren, others in my program, and I met a lot of people at Kent State, including Alan Canfora, and people who were shot, right? And I did a lot of oral history around that, and I did my whole thesis on the interpretations, the vernacular interpretations of the people who were involved in the protests, including some of the National Guard. And 25 years later, it was like they were still on totally opposite sides of the commons of that field, right? They had never really gotten any of the narratives together. And part of that is because the administration and the media in particular, as well as the Scranton Commission even blamed the Nixon administration, and that went nowhere. The lawsuit petered out by 1979 and had almost zero culpability for anybody that happened, and the victims' families got a pittance of several. They split up maybe, I think it was $600 and some thousand between 15 of the plaintiffs, perhaps. It drops in the bucket here. All the trauma that happened to those families. Well, one of the families was the family of Allison Krauss, who was murdered at Kent State. And I became friends with her sister, Laurel Krauss, who was a teenager when Allison was murdered. And I later spoke at the Kent State Truth Tribunal that Laurel went on to found in 2010 in New York. And I subsequently followed up on her, where we wrote an historiographic piece in the Censored 2013 book on protest and Kent State murders. And so we went back and looked at the Struba tape and the audio recordings at the time that Stuart Allen, an independent audio and forensic scientist, went back and looked at, and he found an order to fire. He also found a subsequent gunshot, right? He found a gunshot that before the barrage of bullets from the Guard, the 60-some bullets, 70 bullets almost fired from the Guard, killing 4 and wounding 9 others, including people hundreds of yards away that weren't even protesters. And these were guards, by the way, who were, come on, they're kids, right? They're the same age as a lot of the people at college. They were just coming off a violent strike with Teamsters in Akron on almost no sleep with M1 live loaded rifles onto a college campus, right? Where they're kind of like given impunity to do what they will, right? With this law and order rhetoric from the top down. Well, Laurel and I went back and looked at that, and so the gunshot that's heard prior to the Guard actually turns out that is traced to an FBI informant, a known FBI informant, according to the federal government, and Hoover himself, Terry Norman, who had a gun on him. It was fired there. He was being confronted and circled by protesters who were calling him out as a member of COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which was wildly active in the 1960s and 70s before it was outed after the accidental exposure in media Pennsylvania of the documents that exposed COINTELPRO that eventually led to the Church Committee hearings after Watergate. This is such an important part of our history that it just gets shoved down the memory hole, shows how we don't have free expression, free academic freedom, and a truly free press in this country because people are cowed and intimidated away from investigating these kinds of stories because history matters. We can understand far better in the present how the FBI targeted Occupy, how the FBI called Black identity extremists a key threat, while at the same time ignoring the right-wing and white militia groups that they even said were dangerous. They focused more attention on African Americans and Black Lives Matter. This is why this history matters, is because if we don't know the history, if we don't understand where we came from, as George Santayana suggested, well, we're doomed to repeat it. And I don't believe that we repeat history, more like is attributed to Mark Twain. It seems more like it kind of rhymes, right? These patterns are there to show us, right? They're kind of there to show us what we need to be on the lookout for in the present, because there's nothing new under the sun. And these establishment figures go back and recycle everything from propaganda slogans. We've got to fight the terrorists over there so we don't have to fight them over here. Well, that was Woodrow Wilson in World War I, right? I mean, these kind of propaganda slogans, these kind of campaigns, these targeting of activists, none of it's new. The tactics, however, have gotten far more nefarious and insidious.
I was just going to add to that. I thought about Kent State because I just did a show on the incident in Louisville with the National Guard killing David McAtee. It all repeats itself. So That's why I appreciate Project Censored. Mickey, how can my listeners check out the work you're doing?
JG, you can go to projectcensored.org. You can, even though we rail against social media, corporate big tech platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, we're on there. We're criticizing them on there and the censorship that they roll out and deplatform people. So you can go to Project Censored at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can contact me, Mickey, like the mouse, at projectcensored.org. Censored 2020 has been out since late last fall through the Looking Glass. Still an extraordinarily timely book on everything that's been happening in the year before this one. Andy Roth and I put together this police reader, free online at projectcensored.org right now on our front slider. Pre-order The Anatomy of Fake News with Nolan Higdon. Our new documentary, United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, is free on YouTube. So please take these resources and use them. If you're a student or a teacher and you want to get Project Censored on campus, get a hold of us. We've got free critical media literacy curriculum and classroom materials online, both at projectcensored.org and at GCML.org. That's the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, is GCML. We've got a big conference this fall that Nolan and the rest of us are putting together called the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. It's going to be in Oakland. If it's not in person because of coronavirus, it'll be virtual and online. So yeah, we're churning away. And we really appreciate the work that you're doing and the interviews you have and the people that you're bringing onto this great platform. We need more of this kind of thing, and we need people to turn off the corporate media, turn off the State Department propaganda. Let's remember heroes like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and the people that went the extra mile, the modern day Dan Ellsbergs, whether it's Chelsea Manning, Barrett Brown, Dan Ellsberg. I know you just talked to Barrett the other day, right?
Right.
You know, yeah. These people are out there and they need support, and they are on the pulse. They're on the front line of this information war. And I hate war metaphors, but this is definitely something that's happening to us and with us. And we're involved in it, as Diane DiResta said at New Knowledge, and we've quoted her in a United States of Distraction, but for City Lights, we're in it whether we want to be or not. We're part of it, whether we're pawns, whether we're unwitting, or whether we're engaged in it one way or the other. Let's not forget that Vault 7 showed the CIA could manipulate elections and make it look like it came from anywhere in the world. And that was leaked after the 2016 election, right? Let's remember the things that we learn from the Pentagon Papers of our own times. Let's remember that even though we have major news outlets like the New York Times or CNN or what have you, let's remember, A, they're not independent. B, they don't get everything wrong. But C, they also have agendas to peddle, right? And while it's important to follow the propaganda and follow the lines and learn how to discern between fact and fiction, it's also important to understand that broken clocks are right twice a day. It's important not to just throw out a source because they have a history of sensationalism, because it's some of those sources that are going to break major stories. And by the way, a lot of independent sources, from Counterpunch to Mint Press News, are routinely deplatformed and censored online, whether it's from Prop or Not, or losing their station on Twitter or wherever. I encourage people to go to these places and really kind of follow what reporters like Alan McLeod and Whitney Webb are doing at FAIR or at Mint Press News with Manar Mahalish, the great work of Abby Martin and the Empire Files.
Black Agenda Report. There's 1,000,001 different
the Black
websites.
Agenda Report, amazing. And I know you've had them, Danny Haifong and Glenn Ford and Garrison and so many. There's some great people I work with at KPFA, Pacifica, Davey D, Hard Knock Radio. There's just some great Dennis Bernstein, Flashpoints. There are so many people doing so much important journalism, and this is what we highlight in the book every year at Project Censored. We don't just point fingers and castigate the corporate media. We also highlight what we think are the best in the independent reporting from the last year. And so when people say, where do we go get information? We go, well, go look at the sources and the people in the top 25. These are vetted by faculty and professors all over the country. We've got nearly 30 judges that look at these stories. These stories are fact-checked and vetted not only from the source of origin, but several times thereafter until until we actually even get them on our ballot or in the book. So the short of it, go to projectcensored.org. And if there's anything we can do to help out or support the work you're doing, let me know. Again, I have the weekly radio show, Project Censored Show. If you've got ideas and you want to come on the program, get in touch. Ever grateful for the work you do here at Parallax Views.
Thank you again, Mickey Huff.
Thank you.